So they're going to get Charlie set up and he'll do his presentation and ask questions. Bathrooms are still there. They didn't move during the break. And then when lunch comes around at 12:30, when we're done, the buffet set up against the wall back here, and we'll just go do all that at that time. All right.
All right, so I'm the guy responsible for lunch being moved to 12:30. So again, don't throw anything. I apologize. Okay, that's fine. No, you guys had, you got to have your questions answered, and I know how important that last session was. So again, bear with me. I'm with EPA Clean Air Markets Division out of Washington, D.C. I work specifically in the emissions monitoring branch. So what I'm responsible for is the implementation of Part 75, monitoring, reporting, record keeping. Hopefully you've heard of ECMPS, that software. What's going on right now? You heard in the beginning that, yes, we are trying to re-engineer ECMPS. It was launched in 2010, 2011. So we had some new rules that are going to require start reporting additional records for certain units. Is anybody in here subject to the MATS rule? Okay, well, then anybody operate a boiler, coal-fired boiler? How about a combined cycle natural gas combustion turbine with an SCR? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, all right. That's fine. That's fine. We cover those too. But this whole re-engineering, the idea, and I'm not the IT guy. I don't get along with computers. They wouldn't let me on the IT team. But the idea, what I've heard is we're moving from a desktop application that requires a download every quarter to synchronize with your local machine if we've made any changes. The future is a web-based application in the cloud where all those changes are going to be made behind the scenes. So when you go to evaluate a new file and report it, you'll get any new enhanced improvements. The format is moving from an XML to a JSON, whatever that means. I heard that it's smaller file size. So hopefully that'll help with your upload and download speeds. It'll also allow us to maintain these tables with all these records. You can imagine how many records we get. So smaller file size is going to help us. We're not talking about reporting new elements. That would require a rule change. This whole re-engineering is being done, fingers crossed, without a rule change. So it's just a matter of going from this version to the next new and improved version. I'd like to say we're on time. Everything's running great. We're ahead of schedule. That's not the case. Stay tuned. Chris Worley, my colleague, is the one who's kind of heading up the re-engineering effort. Supposedly, he's going to have a Teams meeting, teleconference next week, where we're going to announce that we have at least a landing page, a home page for the re-engineering effort with FAQs. It'll also have, fingers crossed, a monitoring plan module where you can start to play around with the new JSON format, the new software, evaluate your files in the new format. I can imagine it's going to take some time before you get up to that point where you can do those types of things, but that's the idea. Rollout's supposed to be January 1, 2024. But again, you guys need a lot of lead time for that. So we got to get our act together and make sure you're ready for that. What happens, I'm sure there's going to be contingencies if things happen. I think I work with some pretty reasonable folks that make good decisions. So whatever needs to happen without upsetting the apple cart, we'll try to do that. What else is going on? We've transitioned from field audits. We don't do a lot of field audits, maybe 4 or 5 a year, but now we're starting to do desk audits. Very similar to a field audit. We ask for the same information. We're not going to ask you for the information you typically already submit the ECMPS. It'd be no good to get that information. We want to see the other information, the RATA test report, the PDFs that you guys look at. Are you maintaining these parameters on your control devices so you do missing data the way you're supposed to do it? Because ECMPS gets a lot, but it also doesn't get a lot. Probably the majority of the information it actually doesn't get. It's a great tool, does a lot of checks, can do calculations really well, but it can't do a lot of the verification that things were inputted correctly. Never sees 1 minute data. That's hourly data is all we ever see. When we get a RATA test, for example, we get 1 or 2 summary pages. whereas you guys get the PDFs that are 200 and 300 pages. So that's the kind of stuff we want to look at during a desk audit. We are not compliance. Purpose of, I'm going to move, sorry. Purpose of what we do is Part 75 implementation. I can't write a notice of violation. I don't want to write anybody a notice of violation. What I want to do is help you guys understand how to implement Part 75. That's what I want to do. That's what I want to accomplish. If you have questions about, what do I do if this happens, or I'm doing this maintenance activity, what should I do? Those are the kind of questions I want to ask. If you exceeded your state limit, I have no jurisdiction over that and really don't even want to know. Part 75 compliance is pretty easy. You have allowances, you have emissions. You have to have more allowances than you have emissions. That's pretty much the end of the story. There is a Part 76 limit. None of you guys have that because you're not coal-fired boilers. That's a NOx pound per million BTU. So if you're wondering why do I monitor and report NOx pound per million BTU for Part 75, it's because way back when they said NOx was part of a acid rain contributor. So they set NOx limits for coal-fired boilers, but they said we're going to make the gas and oil-fired units do it also. So now I know it's handy data and you guys use it for a lot of reasons. And it's also used, is anybody in the CASPER program? One person, okay. So that's a NOx mass program that's going to be using that NOx pound per million BTU data for your gas fire units times your heat input to give you a NOx mass value. But what was the third thing I wanted to mention? Desk audits. Oh, rule change. You guys, Part 75, these QA requirements for RADAs, linearity checks, daily calibrations, they've been around for 20, 25 years now. I mean, look what's happened to this industry. You went from coal-fired units with 1,000 parts per million of NOx to combined cycle units with 1 ppm of NOx. Meantime, Part 75 is set still. So we have alt specs, for instance, a NOx RADA. Does anybody emit less than 0.015 pound per million BTU? Probably everybody, right? Pretty close to it. Well, that's the alt spec to pass the annual frequency for a RADA. The other one is plus or minus 10 parts per million. Well, if you're only emitting 1 or 2, 3 parts per million, not hard to meet 10 ppm. So there is a little more momentum trying to get around to revising Part 75 parts of it. Some parts to eliminate petition processes for things like Coriolis meters, trying to eliminate things like that. If you want to do GCV on an hourly basis instead of monthly samples, things like allowing you to do that. And then also revisiting these alt specs to get them more in line with this whole utility sector that's moved from uncontrolled coal-fired boilers to combined cycle SCR units. And most of the coal-fired boilers, practically speaking, now have SCRs, where 20, 25 years ago, no one had an SCR and there were hardly any combined cycle units out there. So it's going to be a public rulemaking. There'll be plenty of chance to, comment. We'll respond to the comments, all that good stuff. So it's not like we're going to just put something in the CFR direct final and that'll be, it's not going to work like that. There'll be plenty of opportunity. We want to hear from you guys. I learn a ton from you guys every day. So I'll be here today all day. Come talk to me, ask me questions. I'll probably ask you questions. Feel free just to come up and say hi. Yeah, I heard this already. I don't have any jurisdiction over Part 60 or Part 63 for that matter. But a lot more and more Part 75 data is being used for these other programs like Part 60. Maybe you've heard of Quad T for the CO2 for the new combustion turbines combined cycle. They use our reported CO2 data, which is actually calculated most of the time from Appendix D and that sort of thing. What Dave is asking is, can we harmonize? There was a harmonization effort many years ago with subparts DA, Quad K, GG, and I think there would be obviously interest in going further. But at this point, no, this is be more of a focused Part 75 effort. To the extent you guys can give me ideas on how to harmonize programs, I'd love to hear that. You know, here's where we think where you can eliminate redundancy between 60, 63, 75. Now, some of that's going to take buy-in from your states too, because your states have a say in this. They're the ones that get delegated Part 60. So even if you went to the EPA folks on the Part 60 side, the states can still kind of trump that redundancy regardless. So just keep that in mind. 75 is not delegated to the states. You're looking at one of maybe 6 or 7 people that implement Part 75. We do rely heavily on the states. I beg and plead for their help for doing audits, you know, observing tests, reviewing reports, all that good stuff. So I don't want you to get the impression that we don't work with the state folks. We do, and I really cherish their help. So, yeah. Well, and see, that's already in place for things like DA, DG, Quad K. But I don't know how you get. Now, see, we don't do CO. See, so yeah, we got to get into this down to the specifics. So, yeah. All right. So whoever's recording me now, turn it off, because what I'm going to say is I don't want anybody to hear this. Well, what I'm going to say might sound a little shady to you guys, but I want you to think about this. Part of the problem is 75 is 25 years old with those QA requirements. If we were to bring those, and I know you don't want to hear this, if we were going to bring those specs down in line with these low emitters, you know, and go from 12 parts per million to, something a lot lower. If we're going to bring the RADA specs from 0.015 down to point something something, that would probably help in that effort to further harmonize between Part 60 and 75. Because if I look at Part 60, there are pieces of it right now that are more stringent than 75. You got to take that off to erase that because my boss will kill me, but it's obvious when you look at it. So a lot of those state agencies, California and all, they look at those Part 75 and they recognize, hey, 20% relative accuracy on a RADA, that's a lot tighter than 0.015 as an alt spec, or 10 or 12 parts per million, right? So if we bring our stuff in line, those state agencies are going to be more, it's going to be more palatable for them. So I think that's, you know, when we go and if we ever go and propose our rule, I'm expecting a lot of positive feedback and support from you guys saying, yep, that's the way to go. Get it down there. Unless it's turned off. See, I hear a lot of support for this rulemaking, so I'm expecting all kinds of supportive comments. Oh, I know. You know, we don't even require linearity checks to be reported to us with span and ranges 30 ppms or less. Well, all you are at 30 ppms or less, 10. We don't even require us to see that because again, when Part 75 was written back then, 25 years ago, you didn't have SCRs, you didn't have combined cycle units hardly at all. So anyway, yeah, that's a topic that comes up all the time with state agencies as well. They want to know from me, can you give us a presentation comparing and contrasting Part 75 and 60? I'm hesitant because first of all, I don't do Part 60 and I don't want to make a mistake on the Part 60 stuff. Secondly, it's going to show these kind of things glaringly. If I do that, if I'm, you know, and I try to be upfront and honest about it, it's going to say, they're going to look at it and say, well, we always thought Part 75 was the tightest standard, and we're looking over here, and they don't have that similar spec under Part 60. So a lot of support for the rule change. I love it, love it. All right, let me get into Part 75. This is a real quick overview. Just try to hit key terms. I apologize if you're hungry. It'll taste better when we finally get there. Where do you find Part 75? I always go to the ECFR. Just click on that link. That's the best place to look for it. It's, you know, don't use, I used to keep an unofficial version at my desk. It's dangerous to do that. You know, there's always updates, things like that. This is it's searchable. It's so easy to find stuff now. I discovered, you know, I'm not a computer person. I discovered Control F. Man, what a tool. What a tool. If you know what term to write in there. Definitions for Part 75 aren't found in Part 75. They're found over here in 72.2. I mentioned out of control. That's a defined term in 72.2. It has a distinct meaning. It means I failed a test. And before I can do anything as far as report valid data, I got to pass that test. Protocol gas, diluent caps. Talk a lot about that. If you know how NOx pound per million BTU works, you understand what a diluent cap is. It's when I'm on startup and that equation goes haywire because I got 20.8% oxygen, 1 or 2 parts per million or maybe more, and now my NOx pound per million BTU looks like 3,608 pound per million BTU. Part 75 says I use a cap. I don't use that measured value. I don't use 20.8 on a turbine. I use 19%. Brings that value down to something more reasonable. It's something to consider if you're running. I was talking to Dave last night. It's something to consider if you're using our data for Part 60 purposes. They have startup, shutdown, malfunction exclusions, but I think they're moving away from that, especially states where they're having you account for everything and they're focusing on startups. And that's a problem with these equations. They weren't designed, F factors weren't designed, fuel factors weren't designed for startup situations. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. What's the purpose of Part 75? Originally, it was established for the monitoring, record keeping, and reporting for acid rain. For acid rain. 75 through 78 defines the purpose of the regulation, the extent of its applicability, compliance dates, prohibition. Applicability is found in 72.6. Generally speaking, if you're 25 megawatt generator serving the public, selling electricity publicly, you're going to get caught by acid rain. There are some exemptions for IPPs, things like that. And it can be actually units smaller than that, but that's a different, again, engines, and that's a different subject. I'm not the applicability person. It was intended for utility-owned boilers and turbines serving, just like I said, electrical generators, rated capacity 25, selling electricity grid. Require source, here's the 3 big ones: SO2 pounds per hour, NOx pound per million BTU, and CO2 tons per hour. If you're an acid rain unit, you're going to be reporting hourly data for those 3. Now, you're also going to have NOx ppm, O2%, SO2 in your case, you're going to be doing probably Appendix D. Heat input, you're going to do Appendix D. Subpart H came later. That was when folks in the Northeast looked at the acid rain program and said, man, we like the way that's working. Let's do NOx mass the same way. Let's have allowances and let's do trading. Worked real well. It was the OTC program, and then the CARE program came along, and then the CASPER program, and then the 3rd version of the CASPER program got proposed. But most of you guys are not in that. Most of you guys are SO2 mass. CO2 mass was a part of the Clean Air Act. It wasn't compliance, but you had to monitor and report it. It was for planning purposes, I guess. I've looked at, I forget what section the Clean Air Act said you had to do that. Certify a new system completed with 180 calendar days after a new unit commences commercial operation. That's another defined term in 72.2, commence commercial operation. 180 days after the date on which the unit becomes affected. So that's a unit that was exempted and now it became affected. It lost its IPP exemption or something like that, if you're familiar with PERPA and things like that. Certification must be completed on all monitoring systems in 90 unit operating days or 180 days. This is if you are adding a new stack with an add-on control device. Most of you guys aren't going to get covered by that. That was for coal-fired units back in the East that put on SCRs or FGDs, things like that. Subpart B, 7510 through 19, general emission requirements. There's special instructions in there for common stacks, multiple stacks. If you guys got bypass stacks, that might fall into your category. Monitoring system required to be in operation, monitoring anytime a unit combusts any fuel. So that's, just keep that in mind. And if let's say I use fossil fuel to start up, and after that I burn a biomass fuel all the time. You still got to account for that biomass fuel all the time because you burn some fossil fuel. So again, if you're burning any fuel, it's going out any stack, you got to account for that. There is an exception if you're using a CEMS for very low sulfur fuel. You guys aren't in that category. But if I was a coal unit that converted to natural gas, I had an SO2 CEMS, I wanted to continue to use the SO2 CEMS, I can do that, but now I got to report a minimum of 2 ppms of SO2 every hour, even if I'm measuring 0.1. Does anybody measure SO2 with a CEMS? Any of you gas-fired turbines? Anybody? No? Okay, good. I didn't think so, but I was hearing certain things. Maybe it was different units, industrial units, or some refineries. Minimum data capture. This is a big one. 7510. Your CiSCO, your DAS programmer, they understand all that. You know, you use every reading, but at a minimum, you have to have one reading in every quadrant of the hour, unless you're doing a QA activity, and then you got to have 2 minutes separated by 15 minutes and 2 separate quadrants. That good stuff. And then you can report a valid hour. 7519 is a big one. It's odd because it's located in 19 and not in an appendice, but it is a monitoring method in and of itself. Gas and oil-fired units only. You have to qualify. You have to emit less than 25 tons of SO2. That's usually not a trouble with gas and oil-fired. It's the 100 tons of NOx annually or 50 tons ozone season that trips people up. And it's all or nothing. So if you're doing LME, you're not doing Appendix D, you're not doing CEMS, you're doing LME for everything. And there's defaults in there. They're very high. They're conservative. They're intended to be that way because this is supposedly the least cost alternative, but we want to make sure you're not underreporting. So there are alternatives in there, way too many in my opinion, for determining an alternative to the table value for the NOx default emission rate. You can do testing, all kinds of different iterations of the testing, 4 points, 3 points, 2 points, maybe 1 point. Identical units, I can do subsets. If I have 3 identical units, I can do 1 out of the 3. On and on and on. Subpart C, process for certification and recertification. The big one's 7520. It does specify this term out of control. And again, there is a difference between out of control and invalid data. Bias adjustment factors lays out all the tests I need to do for each monitoring system in order to certify the unit or recertify, not the unit, the monitoring system. Took me a long time to figure out what was the difference between initial and recert. So my conclusion is initial is required at locations where a monitoring system was never previously certified. So obviously if I have a new unit, that's an initial. If I build a new stack and I've never sampled at that new stack, that's an initial. There are differences there as far as timelines. How long do I have to get certified? Recertification is shorter than initial. There's also notification requirements, things like that. The tests that you do to certify and recertify, pretty much the same. Conditional data, that's a provision to help you with data substitution. So I put in a new analyzer today, I can debug it, I run what they call probationary calibration. That starts a window. And I have to complete certain tests in a certain time frame. And if I do those, don't make any adjustments to the monitor, and they all pass, then I can keep all that data. I think this is the one time where if you fail a test, it has retroactive consequences, meaning normally if I fail a test, I go out of control prospectively. But when you're doing conditional data, the condition is that you pass the test. If you do not pass the test, you invalidate back to the beginning. I think that's the one time you do retroactive. Procedures for both initial and recert. Again, it specifies all the different types of tests. Reference method tests, they're in 7522. They pretty much follow. There are certain exceptions. You can't use a rake probe to do a instrumental reference method. Rake probes would be the multi-hole probes. So even though your equipment can have multi-holes and you can sample that way, the reference method's got to be a single point probe. And I'm talking about part 75, not talking about part 60. That's just one example. You can't make a cylinder gas on site using, I forget what the method is. Forget what it is, but a conditional test method. You got to have an EPA protocol gas. So there are certain exceptions in 7522 that you might want to keep in mind. Somebody a lot smarter than me, I guess, decided that, there could be an issue with getting sample volumes and an equivalent volume through each one of those points, sample points, so that you get a homogeneous sample. I'm not saying it's something we couldn't consider in the future, but it would also be something OAQPS would have to add to their method. See, they own the method, we don't. So just keep that in mind. We're not equipment specific. You can install anything you want to measure and monitor. Put 100, as long as it passes the RADA. Yep. Now, one thing I always think about was, yeah, it passed that RADA. What's a RADA? It's a snapshot. It's a stack test. How do I know 6 months from now they're still going to be operating that equipment the same way they did at the time of the RADA? So that gets all back to your QA, QC, your operating procedures. That's the stuff that we don't look at through ECMPS. And if somebody were to think about that and come across that type of situation and during an audit, they would say, okay, how do you know that your sampling equipment is operating the same way that you do during your RADA? Because that is a requirement. If I'm adding some kind of an adjustment factor, which believe it or not, you can do, you got to apply that adjustment factor consistently all the time, all the way up till the next RADA. And then if it passes, that's fine. And I could get it there. We're down in the weeds, but anyway, just keep that in mind. But no, if you want to install equipment with multi-point probes, 4 probes, 2 probes, have at it. That's a bias adjustment factor. That's different. That's different. And that's a confusing thing. Yeah. We did a insights paper here on substitute data. I've already skipped ahead. Sorry, this is 30 through 37. So this is the missing data procedure. So in part 75, you have to count for every hour. You can't have any gaps in your data. Every hour the unit operates, burns fuel, you have to account for that. If your monitor is out of control, invalid, whatever, you got to report something for that hour. So that's what missing data, it's very different from part 60. Part 60 doesn't use missing data, doesn't use bias adjustment factors. But what we found is you guys are doing a heck of a good job at maintaining these systems. Your percent monitor availability is like 99%, high 90s. So missing data is really not a big chunk of your data. It doesn't skew our data that much. A lot of people like to do queries from a program perspective. And one thing I always caution people is keep an eye on missing data, because sometimes it's representative, sometimes it can be very conservative given the situation. And you don't want to use that for modeling or planning if it's really not representative of what somebody would think was their actual emissions. But it's meant to be conservative because, again, it's an allowance trading. That's the way this thing was, the mindset was allowance trading. It wasn't startup limits and short-term limits. I already said that. There's algorithms used for initial and standard missing data. Once you build up a percent monitor availability, you get into the standard missing data thing. One thing I'll caution you about, you have an SCR and you have an hour missing data, you're supposed to monitor parameters on that SCR's operation. We don't tell you what parameters to monitor. I would intuitively monitor reagent feed rate. And then I would set a boundary. And we don't say what you set as your parametric range either. But somewhere you're supposed to document what that's supposed to be. So I'm just making numbers up. Let's say I say my SCR operates at 1 liter per minute to 10 liters per minute. Well, I have an hour missing data. Am I between 1 and 10? Yes. Well, then good. Use standard missing data. So you could do like 1 hour average an hour before, hour after. It's a nice representative hour. What if you can't show that you're between 1 and 10? Well, now you go to the whole opposite extreme and put in the maximum uncontrolled emission rate, and it looks ugly. And you're rolling along at 0.001. Now all of a sudden you're at 1.2 pound per million. Sounds ridiculous, but that's something ECMPS doesn't check. It doesn't check that those. Now, if I'm doing a desk audit, I might ask you, show me where you developed your parametric ranges and show me during these hours of missing data where you were at that time frame. You got to be way down in the weeds to ask those questions, but they are required, and it makes a huge difference between what value you're going to use either for an hour or 24 hours or ever how long. They use historical data for missing data. Again, this whole thing about PMA. So you're probably familiar with that. Even in Part 60, it says you got to maintain your monitor at 80% availability or 90% or whatever. Same kind of concept, except this then dictates what value you use for substituting that out. Whereas Part 60, I fall below 80%, I get an NOV or something like that. Pound per million BTU and stack flow data, they are grouped by load bins. So that kind of helps. The idea is there's a correlation between load and NOx emission rate. So allow you to group by load bin. If you're in load bin 7, you have hour missing data. You look at load bin 7 historical data and you pick a value in that load bin. You wouldn't go to load bin 10 or load bin 1. But your DAS is programmed for that already. You don't have to worry with that. Subpart E is alternatives to monitors. There's not many out there. PEMS. It doesn't have to be a PEMS, but it could be something else. Requires a petition, requires a comparison, 720 hours at a minimum between a certified CEMS and a reference method against your parametric system. So it's a pretty heavy lift. Subpart F, record keeping and monitoring. It's kind of been with the monitoring plan, the emissions, and the QA data. And there's a record keeping section, and there's a reporting section. Itemizes everything. 7557 has method of determination codes. So if you're looking at rows of data, there's this thing called a method of determination code. If you see an 01, that means it comes from a certified QA CEMS. If you see something like a 12 or an 11, well, that might be missing data or a diluent cap or something like that. But it allows me to know, what am I looking at? Am I looking at quality assured data? Am I looking at missing data? Am I looking at a range exceedance, et cetera, et cetera? It's a good thing to have. Subpart G, the reporting, again, the reporting pretty much goes back to the record keeping items. It says, okay, this gets reported electronically and this gets maintained hard copy. And there's a lot that gets maintained hard copy, like I was talking about, RADA test reports, parametric data, all that good stuff. Submissions have to be made by the DR, designated representative. You fill out a form, you send it to our group. You can be an agent. You can be an alternate to a DR. Those have to make submissions. Technically, even notifications have to be sent by those folks. Unfortunately, if you're not a DR, you're notifying somebody, dotting your I, crossing your T about a initial cert RADA. It has to come from these folks with a statement. I certify, best of my knowledge, etc. There's a statement that comes with that, and it's all out of 7221 or something like that. But your DR knows all about that. Subpart H, that's the whole NOx mass thing. I'm not going to even bother with that. You guys, except for one, we can go over that, but you're probably very familiar. Yeah. Appendix A, this sets up the CEMS installation and certification test procedures. Sets up how do I determine span and range, MPC, max potential concentration, do a span and range evaluation. When do I need a dual range? Things like that. That's all in A. Also gets into the RADA test procedures. If your stack tester's telling you I'm following 7E, and they're only following 7E, might have problems because determining the sample points for a reference method 7E is done here, not in 7E. So if you're doing a single point reference method sample, for example, it better have been preceded by a 12-point strat test, and it better meet the criteria in Appendix A, well, for you guys won't be hard because it's 3 ppms or 3%. So, but anyway, they still need to do that 12-point strat test each and every time. The idea is, like you've heard before, ductworks start to leak, things change, patterns change, stratification, stacks get shorter, things happen. But there's confusion sometimes between the reference methods and Part 75 as far as sampling procedures. Appendix B, that's the ongoing QA requirements. That's where you get into things like grace periods. I think grace periods are a great thing. It makes no sense to me to say, okay, you got to do a test every calendar quarter. What if I didn't operate that calendar quarter? Does that make me turn the unit on just for that purpose? Part 75 says no. When you start it up, we'll give you 168 hours to do that linearity or 720 hours to do that RADA test, things like that. It also has real specific data validation language. It says, if I fail a test, you start invalidating on this hour, you continue to invalidate until that hour. I love Part 75 for that. I hate Part 60 is great too, not to knock my brethren, but 75 is, and it has to be that way for 75 because it's an electronic program. It's all reported hourly data. It's all tried to verify that hourly emissions data against all that QA tests. It needs that specificity. C, don't even know why we have it. I can't imagine an alternative to missing data from 75, 30 through 34. It does talk about load bins, which are important. D, a lot of you guys are doing D. That's for SO2 mass, and that's for heat input. So you're doing sulfur sampling, GCV sampling, or you're following contracts. You're using fuel flow meters. You're calculating heat input. You're taking that heat input, using equation G4 to calculate your CO2 mass. It's not used for the NOx pound per million BTU calculation. It's used for SO2 mass calculations. And again, it's also used for CO2 mass calculations. There are its own data substitution requirements, no grace period. So your fuel flow meter doesn't get a grace period. It is on a calendar quarter basis. Actually, sometimes it's a fuel flow meter QA operating quarter basis. Talk about that too. But there's no grace periods. E is for NOx pound per million BTU. It's a stack test for load points. You have to do Appendix D with it because on the x-axis is your heat input. And then your y-axis are these NOx pound per million BTU curve. You pick a point on the x-axis, you go up, and that's the pound per million BTU value you're going to report for that hour. How many? Not many, I don't think. It's a good question. I'm always looking at that. And I have a spreadsheet back in the office for that purpose, and I don't know off the top of my head. LME is 500 or 600 units. I would think Appendix E, nowadays, you have to be, it's oil and gas only, you have to be a peaking unit also. And one thing I'll say, if you use LME, which doesn't make sense to me, you don't have to be a peaking unit. Peaking unit is a capacity factor. 10% on average for 3 years, no more than 20% any given year. I would say Appendix E units are probably less than 100. Well, you shouldn't have told me that because now it's like, well, why in the world aren't you using those NOx CEMS? Is there? No, I mean, why are you using LME? Well, that makes me happy. That's where I want to get at LME and change it so that you can't do that. So I want to put it, again, turn the recording off. Yeah, turn the recorders off. But the idea is you go from one level of accuracy to another. So you start off with your CEMS, you go to Appendix D, you go to Appendix E, and then you go to LME. But it's easier to qualify for LME than it is Appendix E. How does that make sense? Rhetorical question. Bothers me a lot. But anyway. No grace periods for Appendix E, simplified data substitution. Appendix F, that's where all your equations are found, NOx pound per million BTU, diluent caps, F factor tables. They're there. Diluent cap procedures, it's a great thing. Well, I think it's a great thing. Somebody else might disagree. Appendix G, that's your CO2 mass calculations. Most of you guys are using G4. If you're in RGGI, which is a regional greenhouse gas initiative in the Northeast, you can't use G1. G1's an estimation methodology. think we're down to 20 or 25 units that use G1 instead of G4. None of the coal units use G1. G1, again, I don't know why it's there, but the coal units are using F11. They already monitor CO2. They have stack flow monitors, so they just use those to calculate and report CO2 mass. Everybody does it. Coal units. Be here the rest of the day. I'm going to try to cut out early because they said getting a cab here is kind of like getting Pony Express, but I'm going to try anyway. I intended to stay a little longer tomorrow. Love to talk to you guys. I can stick around all day. There's Reggie. Fine. Good to see you. Well, I'll tell you my answer. ASME 9M. You don't need a petition for that. Do the weight gravimetric method. Forget about going through the petition process. 9M. No, ma'am. We found that out after we issued all these petitions. You know, Bob Valero started this for me 6 years ago. And then somebody said, well, we can use ASME 9M, can we? I thought, well, sure. We didn't think you could do. See, I'm real dumb when it comes to fuel flow meters. I wish I could tell you I've read every AGA, ASME method and I can recite them verbatim. And they all are, you know, do the quality assurance against a flowing fluid and meet 2% of the upper range value and all that. I don't. So there's a lot I could learn from you guys on the fuel flow meters. What I try to do on an ad hoc basis is do a kind of back of the envelope heat rate calculation just to compare quarter over quarter heat rates for Appendix D units to see if there's a shift in the heat rates, and if so, why? If there's a 10, 20, 30% heat rate at the same load bin, so let's look at load bin 8, heat rate changed by 20 or 30%. Well, why was that? Did your GCV all of a sudden change? Did you change a new fuel? What did you do? You became 20 or 30% more efficient. I'd like to tell a lot of folks how to do that for obvious reasons. But, and again, I come to you with questions, not with fingers pointed saying you did something wrong. Just explain to me, why did that heat rate change? Because fuel flow meters, they don't do daily calibrations. They don't do RADAs. They send their fuel flow meter out to a laboratory typically. There's no reinstallation requirements to verify it was even reinstalled properly. Is it reinstalled in a part of the pipe that gives you a representative value? You know, if I install it in a curve in a pipe and then I put it on a bench that has a 10-foot long run, is that going to give me the same answer? There's a lot, but think about what Appendix D was created for. It was created for SO2 mass for the acid rain program from a gas-fired boiler or combustion turbine. Did we really care if it was? I hope this thing's turned off. I'm gonna get fired. But now we care a lot because that fuel flow meter is being used for other reasons, mainly CO2 inventory, right? So that matters a lot for those reasons. Sure, yeah. Now, you can do everything and still pass it. Yeah, and we hear that sometimes. We get called up and say, well, we don't have to do the primary element inspection. We noticed that the orifice plate was backwards. You know, ECMPS, they don't take pictures and we don't get pictures sent to us. And there's a lot of qualitative type tests when it comes to Appendix D, where again, you're not, it's a whole different world from CEMS, but it's becoming more and more and more important because again, who am I talking to? All the gas-fired combined cycle units. Yeah. So what I was talking about is I calibrate my fuel flow meter at a laboratory. It's a spare meter. I bring it back to my facility. I put it on a shelf. Is it good forever? No. What happens is there's a 20 calendar quarter clock that starts from the day it was certified in the lab, quality assured in the lab. So I get 20 calendar quarters, or if I install it, let's say I install it 6 months later. Now, from that date of installation starts the clock of 4 QA operating quarters. which is 168 hours of operation on that fuel flow meter. Whichever it hits first, that's when it's going to go out of control. But you can keep it on a shelf for, years, and then once it gets installed, now it's still going to look at that 20 calendar quarter clock. So it's still looking at both. The 20 calendar quarter clock starts when the laboratory test is done. The QA quarter starts when it's installed. It would go back to the date it was quality assured. Yeah. It doesn't extend it another 20. Yeah. Wouldn't do that. Yeah, well. So fingers crossed, hit up Chris Worley with the new and improved ECMPS 2.0. Yeah, I know. We can override things like that and allow to use a fuel-specific MER, and we have done that. Sometimes we go through a petition process. Again, I hope this thing's turned off. Sometimes we don't. It just makes sense that you wouldn't put in an oil-fired MER if you're firing gas. Yeah. You guys, I hope I don't get fired next week. Good. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, that makes sense. I don't want to do petitions. I hate petitions. They're administrative nightmares, and they all usually turn out the same way.
That for Q3 2022 or 2022 or Q4 2024 reporting.
The target is Q1, January 1st, 2024. Now, I know. That's why I'm not on that team, see? I'm not on the IT team, and I'm thankful. But I'd like to tell you they're on schedule, and we got a nice mock-up right now that you can test out all three modules: monitoring plan, QA, emissions reporting. You'll have 6 months ahead of time with the QA instructions. You'll be able to hit the ground running January 1st, 2024. But I'm not going to guarantee anybody that. I guarantee you that. I don't need to tell Chris Worley and my boss, Jeremy Shrivels, that you guys need lead time for obvious reasons. They know that. So I'm sure there's contingencies to be able to do something. The thing that's pushing January 1, 2024 is the MATS electronic rule for the coal-fired units. That's what's pushing that date. So we got to have the capability to collect those records one way or the other. If everything is, nice and bright and shiny and tested by then for everybody, then that's fine. But again, these people, I'm gonna get fired. I know I am, but I view them as pretty reasonable people that have been through this. They recognize the time it takes to go from one software version to the next. DAS vendors need a lead time. Industry needs lead time for budgeting. Things cost money, even though they're supposedly new and improved. And that was really, honestly, that was the purpose of this. It wasn't just for our sake, but it was hopefully to make your life better and easier. And if we don't accomplish that, then we failed. I won't be back next year. I'm probably gonna be working. I'll probably be selling hot dogs out on the corner. But that was the purpose of this. 30 days to what? Get ready for it?
No, for the
Oh.
You have the quarterly. You have 30 days to do that. The entire nation has to switch over.
Well, you know, ideally you're going to have plenty of lead time to be ready for that.
Okay,
So
I
that,
understand it.
yeah. So when Chris has his Teams conference call next week or whenever it happens, you know, impress upon him, and he knows it already, but impress upon him, Chris, we need to account for budgeting. We need to account for programming time, changeovers. You know, this is the amount of time we need. You know, give him a reasonable, honest answer. And if you're expecting to do all this without a rule change, you know, we got to make you guys happy, or else it's not going to happen. You know, we'll have lawyers coming out of the woodwork, and I wouldn't blame anybody. You know, to look at a particular plant, that's always a good question. You know, we have this thing called the targeting tool for field audits. We look at things like low percent monitor availability, failed RADAs, a failed linearity test. We look at a whole bunch of different checks and then identify on a point system like, well, who's the higher? You know, we targeted mainly coal-fired units, although a lot of people are asking to start targeting gas-fired units. And so we're trying to develop a checklist, and Bob Valero helped me do this before he left, for Appendix D. Very comprehensive, and I appreciate that. So, but that's the idea, is that you would find, and it's not to single out people we think have problems, but single out people where, you know, maybe there's something we could learn, or we could help them implement something differently. Sometimes we find people that are actually over-reporting and don't need to be. They're using MPC, the maximum values, when they don't need to be. We found that. We say, you know, you don't need to be reporting that high value, because we'll look at hourly data and we'll look for that monitor method of determination code that says I reported an MPC for an hour, and we'll ask them, well, why did you do that? And sometimes it's a glitch. I don't think it was a CiSCO system. Sometimes it was a glitch in the DAS software. It was just plugging in a value when it shouldn't have been. So all kinds of things come out of these audits. And again, it's not compliance. We invite the state there. I've never had an issue where the state went into compliance mode. Typically, you know, it's very, thankfully, we have a very cooperative working relationship with states and regions. I want to keep it that way. High quality data. That's what my boss's mantra is. That's what we're after. We're after high quality data so that we can use that to make sure everybody's on the same level playing field, and then planning for the future. That's the objective of what we do. I know you guys got to be hungry, because I am. I've sent it to Shane, and Shane can send it to everybody. Yep. And call me anytime. I don't know what your chain of commands are, but, you know, work through however, but I love talking to everybody, technicians, environmental supervisors, you know, whomever. I can learn a ton from you guys. Thanks,
Charlie, thank you so much.